Picture this. It is 1299. You're a soldier on the walls of Delhi, gripping a spear so tight your knuckles are white. The ground beneath your feet is vibrating. That is not an earthquake. That is the sound of 200,000 Mongol horses thundering toward you. For decades, these warriors have been the grim reapers of Asia, turning emperors into slaves and cities into graveyards. But today, something is different. Through the dust, you don't just see soldiers. You see wagons, you see tents, you see families. This isn't a raiding party looking for gold. This is a migration. They haven't come to rob you. They have come to replace you. This is the Battle of Kili 1299, the moment the unstoppable object hits the immovable object. Most kings would run, most generals would hide, but the man leading you is about to do the unthinkable. He orders the gates to open. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. We need to understand exactly why that vibration on the walls of Delhi was so terrifying. By the late 13th century, the Mongols weren't just an army, they were a force of nature. They had cracked the code of medieval warfare. They were faster, deadlier, and more disciplined than any force on earth. The Chagatai Khanate. The Mongol faction controlling Central Asia had their eyes locked on India. They viewed the subcontinent not as a kingdom to be respected, but as a bank vault to be cracked open. But the intelligence reports hitting the Sultan's desk in late 1299 changed everything. The scouts weren't reporting the usual hit-and-run tactics. They reported a massive, slow-moving ocean of humanity led by Qutlugh Khwaja, the ferocious son of the Mongol ruler. The presence of women and children in the Mongol baggage train was the ultimate red flag. In the brutal language of steppe warfare, this signalled colonization. If they won at Kili, there would be no Delhi left to rebuild. They would turn the mosques into stables and the palaces into pastures. Panic didn't just spread through Delhi, it exploded. The city was already overpopulated. Filled with refugees fleeing the borderlands, food supplies were choking. The streets were a riot of terrified civilians trying to flee south, clogging the very roads the army needed to use. The mood was apocalyptic. Every advisor, every general, and every holy man in the court screamed the same advice to the Sultan. Barricade the gates, fortify the walls, and wait them out. It was the sensible choice. It was the safe choice. But Alauddin Khalji was not a safe man. To understand how a single city could stand against a continental empire, we have to look into the eyes of the man holding the leash of the Delhi Sultanate. Alauddin Khalji is one of history's most fascinating paradoxes. In the storybooks of any other nation, he would be the villain. He was a man who viewed mercy as a defect and affection as a liability. Yet, in the winter of 1299, he was the only thing standing between Indian civilization and total extinction. Alauddin's rise to power reads like a Shakespearean tragedy soaked in gasoline. Just 3 years prior, the Sultanate was ruled by his uncle, Jalaluddin, a kind, lenient old man who believed in forgiveness. Alauddin saw this kindness as a disease. In a move that shocked the medieval world, Alauddin lured his uncle to a meeting on a boat, pretending to ask for forgiveness for her rebellion. As the old man embraced him, weeping with relief, Alauddin gave the signal. One of his soldiers struck the Sultan down. They didn't just kill him, they severed his head, put it on a spear, and paraded it through the camp while Alauddin sat under the royal canopy, declaring himself the new shadow of God on earth. This was the man now tasked with saving Delhi. Because he had seized power through betrayal, Alauddin lived in a state of hypervigilance. He trusted no one, and this paranoia birthed his first true secret weapon. Not a sword, not an elephant, but information. Alauddin created one of the most terrifyingly efficient intelligence networks the ancient world had ever seen. He employed a legion of spies known as the Munhians. These weren't just military scouts. The Munhians were everywhere. They were beggars in the market, servants in the noble houses, and sweepers in the barracks. They reported everything to the Sultan, from the price of grain to the whisper of rebellion in a general's tent. The fear was so absolute that contemporary chroniclers wrote that nobles stopped speaking to each other in private, communicating only with sign language, terrified that the walls themselves had ears. But here is the twist. This police state was exactly what Delhi needed to survive the Mongols. When the news of the Mongol invasion arrived, the Munhians didn't just report the enemy's location, they dissected the enemy's intent. Alauddin knew the Chagatai tactics. He knew they thrived on chaos and fear, so he countered it with absolute rigid order. While the city panic-bought food, Alauddin's officers seized the markets. He didn't ask merchants to keep prices low. He told them that if they charged a single copper coin more than the fixed rate, he would cut an equal weight of flesh from their bodies. It was brutal, barbaric, and effective. The army was fed. The panic was strangled by the iron grip of the state. Imagine the throne room of Delhi. It is silent. The air is heavy with incense and dread. Alauddin sits on the throne, his face unreadable. Standing before him are the most experienced generals and scholars of the realm. One by one, they step forward to plead with him. Alauddin ul Mulk, the morbidly obese and brilliant city magistrate, one of the few men Alauddin actually respected, spoke for the council. He laid out the math. The Mongols had travelled thousands of miles. The horses were tired. They were in hostile territory. If Delhi simply closed its gates, the summer heat and lack of fodder would destroy the Mongol army within months. Why risk the kingdom on a roll of the dice? History favours the patient. It was sound logic. It was the Sun Tzu approach. Win without fighting. But Alauddin Khalji operated on a different frequency. He stood up and delivered a speech that was recorded by the historian Barani, a speech that gives us a glimpse into his warrior soul. He told them that patience was a luxury for legitimate kings. For a usurper, patience looked like cowardice. If I hide behind these walls, he said, my subjects will see me as weak. And if they see me as weak, they will eat me alive before the Mongols even breach the gates. He wasn't just fighting the Mongols, he was fighting for his legitimacy. He declared that he would march out to Kili not just to defend the city, but to prove a point to the universe. He turned to his generals and gave a simple, chilling order. Prepare the elephants. This was the gamble. Alauddin was taking a distinctive Indian style of warfare, heavy, static, reliant on war elephants and infantry, and pitting it against the fluid, lightning-fast cavalry of Central Asia. He was bringing a hammer to a knife fight. He emptied the dungeons, he opened the armories, he paid every soldier a year's salary in advance, emptying the treasury his uncle had spent a lifetime filling. This wasn't just a military mobilization, it was an all-in bet. He handed command of the right wing to Zafar Khan, a general whose bravery was so legendary that even Alauddin was jealous of him. He took the centre for himself. As the army marched out of the Delhi gates, leaving the safety of stone for the uncertainty of the open plain, the people watched in silence. They knew their sultan was a tyrant. They knew his spies were watching them. But as they looked at the dust rising from the north, they realised that a tyrant was the only shield they had. The Munhians had done their job. The city was locked down. Now it was time for the steel to speak. Let's cross the no man's land and step into the enemy camp. If the atmosphere in Delhi was one of suffocating dread, the atmosphere in the Mongol encampment at Kili was one of festive arrogance. You have to remember, for the Chagatai Khanate, this wasn't a desperate defence, it was a hunting trip. Leading this massive force was Qutlugh Khwaja. He was the son of the reigning Khan, DWA, and he represented a new generation of Mongol royalty. He hadn't grown up in the saddle, suffering the hardships of the Gobi Desert like his ancestors. He'd grown up hearing the stories of how his family owned the world. He was young, hungry, and dangerously eager to carve out his own kingdom. India was his prize. The force he assembled was a masterpiece of mobile warfare. To understand why the world feared the Mongols, you have to look at their technology. It wasn't gunpowder or magic, it was the recurve composite bow. Constructed from horn, wood and sinew laminated together with fish glue, this weapon had a draw weight of over 100 pounds. It could punch through mail armour from a distance where the enemy couldn't even see the whites of the archer's eyes. And they could fire these arrows with sniper-like precision while galloping at full speed, thanks to a simple innovation, the stirrup. which allowed them to stand in the saddle and stabilize their aim. But the real weapon of the Chagatai army wasn't the bow, it was their mind. They didn't fight for honor, they fought to win. Their favorite tactic was the mangudai, the feigned retreat. They would charge, pretend to panic, break formation, and run away. When the enemy, flush with the adrenaline of victory, broke their own ranks to chase them, the Mongols would suddenly wheel around, surround the disorganized pursuers, and slaughter them. They had pulled this trick on Russians, Persians, Hungarians, and Chinese. It worked every single time because it exploited the enemy's ego. Qutlugh Khwaja looked at the Indian army assembling on the plain and likely scoffed. What did he see? He saw a slow, ponderous beast. The Delhi army was built on the ancient Indian model. Massive blocks of infantry, heavy cavalry armoured in chainmail and plate, and of course the war elephants. To a Mongol tactician, this looked like a dinosaur waiting to be hunted. They expected to ride circles around the Indians, peppering them with arrows until they collapsed from exhaustion. However, Qutlugh Khwaja made a critical miscalculation. He underestimated the sheer ferocity of the man leading the Indian vanguard. Enter Zafar Khan. If Alauddin Khalji was the calculating brain of the Delhi Sultanate, Zafar Khan was its beating heart. He was the commander of the right wing, and in 1299 he was arguably the greatest warrior in Asia. His name, Zafar, literally translates to victory. He was a man of such immense physical strength and courage that he'd earned the nickname the Rustam of the Age, referencing the legendary hero of Persian mythology. Zafar Khan was a problem for everyone. He was a problem for the Mongols because he had defeated them before in border skirmishes and had no fear of their tactics, but ironically he was also a problem for his own master Alauddin. Zafar was too popular, the soldiers loved him. He was honourable, brave and charismatic, everything Alauddin was not. Rumours whispered in the court that Zafar Khan could easily take the throne if he wanted to. So, as the armies lined up at Kili, there was a dark, unspoken tension within the Indian lines. Alauddin needed Zafar Khan to win the battle, but he also wouldn't mind if Zafar didn't survive it. It was a macabre game of 4D chess played with human lives. The deployment at Kili was massive. The historical sources like the Tarikhi Firuz Shahi describe the Indian army stretching for miles. Alauddin took the centre, surrounded by his elite guards and the royal canopy. On his left was his brother, Qutlugh Khan, and on the right, the tip of the spear, was Zafar Khan. The Mongols mirrored this formation. Qutlugh Khwaja commanded the centre, orchestrating the movements of 4 tumans or divisions of 10,000 men. The air was filled with the guttural throat singing of the Mongol shamans and the blowing of conch shells from the Indian lines. This was the clash of civilizations that defined the era. On one side, the Chagatai Khanate, the masters of mobility, speed and deception. On the other, the Delhi Sultanate, representing weight, discipline and the raw power of the war elephant. The secret that Alauddin had prepared was about to be revealed. He knew he couldn't outrun the Mongols, so he decided to outshock them. He wasn't going to play a defensive game. He had given Zafar Khan a green light to do what he did best, attack with reckless abandon. The plan was to shatter the Mongol nerve before their tactical brain could kick in. As the sun reached its zenith, the tension broke. A ripple went through the Mongol lines. They began to trot forward, their horsetail banners snapping in the wind. The ground began to shake. The Battle of Kili had begun. The silence broke not with a shout, but with a tremor. When the signal was given, the Delhi army didn't just march. It rolled forward like a landslide, and leading this avalanche was the secret weapon that Alauddin Khalji had banked his empire on. It wasn't a tactic borrowed from the Persians or a formation stolen from the Greeks. It was the terrifying living heritage of medieval Indian warfare, the war elephant. To the modern eye, an elephant in battle seems like a relic, a slow-moving target. But in 1299, against a cavalry-based army, a fully armoured war elephant was the equivalent of a tank rolling over infantry. Alauddin had deployed hundreds of them. These weren't wild beasts, they were trained killers. They were draped in heavy chainmail and plate armour that covered their trunks and ears. Their tusks were tipped with steel spikes coated in poison. On their backs they carried howdahs, wooden towers manned by archers and javelin throwers who rained death down from a height that, Mongol arrows struggled to reach effectively. But the true genius of the elephant against the Mongols wasn't physical, it was biological. Horses are naturally terrified of elephants. The smell of an elephant, the deep guttural rumble of its growl, and its sheer size trigger a primal panic in equines. The Mongol steppes had no elephants. Their horses had never seen such monsters. As the Indian line crashed into the Mongol vanguard, the famed discipline of the Mongol ponies evaporated. Horses reared, threw their riders, and refused to charge. The fluid, water-like movement of the Mongol formation hit a stone wall. This was the moment Zafar Khan had been waiting for. Commanding the right wing, Zafar Khan didn't wait for the centre to engage. He saw the hesitation in the Mongol ranks, the split second where the horses shied away from the elephants, and he capitalised on it with a violence that stunned both armies. He ordered a full charge. Zafar Khan and his elite cavalry didn't just push the Mongols back, they shattered the line. Historical accounts describe Zafar Khan fighting like a man possessed. He wasn't directing the battle from the rear, he was at the tip of the spear. The Indian cavalry, emboldened by their general, cut through the light Mongol armour with heavy tulwars and maces. For the first time in living memory, the Mongols were the ones panicking. The Battle of Kili 1299 was supposed to be a tactical masterclass by Qutlugh Khwaja. Instead, it was descending into a chaotic brawl where the Mongol advantages, speed and range, were nullified by the sheer density of the Indian assault. The dust was so thick that visibility was reduced to zero. It became a meat grinder. The screams of crushed men and the trumpet blasts of elephants drowned out the orders of commanders. Qutlugh Khwaja, watching from his vantage point, must have felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. His left wing, the soldiers facing Zafar Khan, wasn't just losing, it was evaporating. Zafar Khan was driving them back mile after bloody mile. He was pursuing them with such ferocity that he began to separate from the main Indian army. And this is where the battle shifted from a military conflict to a psychological drama. Zafar Khan was winning too hard. In the chaos of the charge, Zafar Khan made a critical error. He let his bloodlust and his desire for glory overtake his tactical discipline. He pushed deeper and deeper into enemy territory, chasing the fleeing Mongols. He assumed the rest of the Delhi army, the centre led by Sultan Alauddin and the left wing led by Qutlugh Khan, would follow him to secure the victory. He thought they were right behind him, supporting his flank, ready to deliver the killing blow to the Mongol invasion. But when Zafar Khan finally pulled on his reins and looked back through the clearing dust, he saw something that must have frozen the blood in his veins. He was alone. The main army of Delhi hadn't moved. Sultan Alauddin Khalji had held the centre firm. He hadn't advanced a single step to support his greatest general. Was it cowardice? Was it caution? Or was it something far more sinister? There is a chilling theory among historians that Alauddin Khalji made a calculation in that moment. He saw the Mongols retreating before Zafar Khan. He knew the battle was turning in his favour, but he also knew that if Zafar Khan returned to Delhi as the man who single-handedly defeated the Mongol Empire, Zafar would be more powerful than the Sultan himself. A hero is dangerous to a tyrant. So, Alauddin stood still. He watched as the gap between Zafar Khan and the safety of the Indian lines grew wider and wider. He watched as the Mongols, masters of the feigned retreat, realised that the Tiger of India had walked into a trap. The Mongol retreat suddenly stopped. The fleeing horsemen wheeled around. Fresh humans emerged from the flanks, cutting off Zafar Khan's path of retreat. The hunter had become the prey. The trap was sprung. The trap had snapped shut. Zafar Khan and his exhausted division were no longer the hunters. They were the bait. As the dust settled, the reality of their situation became horrifyingly clear. The Mongol Tumans that had been fleeing moments ago had reformed into a steel ring, completely encircling the Indian vanguard. 10,000 horsemen against a handful of survivors. In military history, this is usually the moment where the surrounded commander surrenders. There is no shame in it. You have been outmaneuvered. You have been abandoned by your own king. The logical move is to lay down your sword and negotiate ransom. And indeed, the Mongols expected exactly that. Qutlugh Khwaja, the Mongol commander, rode forward. He was stunned. He had never seen a warrior fight like Zafar Khan. In the brutal meritocracy of the steppe, bravery was the only currency that mattered, and Zafar was the richest man on the battlefield. According to the chroniclers of the time, Qutlugh Khwaja actually halted the slaughter to make an offer. He shouted across the lines, offering Zafar Khan a choice. "Come with me to my father, the Khan. We will make you a ruler greater than the one you serve. Why die for a sultan who has left you here to rot?" It was a valid question. Zafar Khan must have known Alauddin betrayed him. He could see the banners of the main Delhi army in the distance, standing perfectly still, watching him die. He had every reason to flip sides. He could have joined the Mongols, returned to Delhi as a conqueror, and taken the head of the man who betrayed him. But Zafar Khan's answer has echoed through centuries of Indian folklore. He reportedly shouted back, "I have eaten the salt of the Sultan. I will not be untrue to my salt." It was a statement of archaic, suicidal honour. He rejected the offer. The negotiations ended. The arrows began. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. However, it was an execution that cost the executioners dearly. Zafar Khan knew he wasn't going home, so he fought with the terrifying liberation of a man who has already accepted his death. The remaining Indian soldiers formed a tight circle. They fought on foot, slashing at the legs of the Mongol horses. Zafar Khan himself, supposedly bristling with arrows like a porcupine, continued to lead the charge until his horse collapsed. Legend says that even after his horse died, he fought on foot, breaking the swords of his enemies, forcing the Mongols to back away and kill him from a distance with a hail of arrows, because none dared to come within the reach of his blade. When Zafar Khan finally fell, a silence likely descended on that sector of the battlefield. The tiger of the age was dead. The Mongols had won the skirmish. They had eliminated the Delhi Sultanate's most capable general. Qutlugh Khwaja had his head. But as the Mongol commanders gathered around the body of their fallen enemy, the mood wasn't one of triumph. It was one of deep, unsettling concern. They had killed Zafar Khan, yes, but the cost had been astronomical. In that single engagement, Zafar's suicidal charge had decimated a significant portion of the Mongol vanguard. More importantly, he had shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. The Mongols looked at their casualties. They looked at the ferocity of the Indian resistance. And then they looked across the plain at the main army of Alauddin Khalji. The bulk of the Delhi forces, nearly 200,000 men and hundreds of fresh war elephants, hadn't even entered the fight yet. If a single division led by one man could hurt them this badly, what would happen when the main army charged? Zafar Khan's death was a tragedy for him, but it was a strategic masterstroke for Delhi. By dying so hard, he'd spooked the enemy. He had planted a seed of doubt in the mind of Qutlugh Khwaja. The Mongols were practical people. They didn't do Pyrrhic victories. If the cost of conquering India was going to be this high, was it worth it? As night fell over the plains of Kili, the screaming stopped. The two armies pulled back to their camps. To the soldiers in Delhi, it felt like a defeat. The hero was dead. The Sultan had done nothing. Morale should have been broken. But in the Mongol camp, the victory tasted like ash. Qutlugh Khwaja was reportedly exhausted, perhaps even wounded in the exchange. The aura of the unstoppable Mongol horde had been pierced by the tip of Zafar Khan's sword. The sun set on a stalemate, but the psychological damage was done. The night was dark, and in the darkness, the secret weapon of Alauddin Khalji, his network of spies and misinformation, was about to make its second move. Night fell over the plains of Kili like a shroud. The screaming had stopped, replaced by the low, agonizing moans of the wounded and the crackle of campfires. In the history of warfare, the night after a major engagement is often more terrifying than the battle itself. It is the time when adrenaline fades and the cold reality of loss sets in. In the Delhi camp, the mood was somber. They had lost their champion. Zafar Khan was dead. The soldiers whispered among themselves, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. If the tiger of the age could be slaughtered so easily, what chance did the rest of them have? All eyes turned to the royal tent, waiting for a sign from Sultan Alauddin Khalji. But Alauddin did not panic. He did not order a retreat to the city walls. In fact, he did something that terrified the Mongols more than any charge could have. He did absolutely nothing. He held his ground. He kept his army in formation, maintaining the siege of the battlefield. This stoicism was his true secret weapon. By refusing to flinch after losing his best general, he sent a silent message to the Mongol commanders. "You killed one man. I have 200,000 more, and I am not moving." Across the dark expanse of the no man's land, in the Mongol camp the situation was unravelling. On paper, the Chagatai Mongols had won the day. They had eliminated the enemy's right flank. But the cost-benefit analysis, the logic that ruled the Mongol war machine, was flashing red. The survivors of the clash with Zafar Khan returned to camp with horror stories. They spoke of elephants that couldn't be killed and men who fought like demons. They looked at their depleted quivers and their exhausted horses. And then there was the matter of Qutlugh Khwaja. Historical records from this period are murky, often written years later, but a persistent detail emerges from the fog of history. It is believed that Qutlugh Khwaja, the prince of the Chagatai Khanate, was not just tired, he was dying. Some accounts suggest he was wounded in the chaotic melee with Zafar Khan's forces. Others suggest the intense heat of the Indian plains, combined with the stress of the campaign, had triggered a sudden fatal illness. Whatever the cause, the head of the snake was sick. The invincible leadership of the Mongol army was compromised. Imagine the chaos in the Mongol command tent. Their prince is failing. Their horses are spent, and facing them is an Indian sultan who seems completely indifferent to death, backed by an army that vastly outnumbers them and hasn't yet committed its main force. The Mongols were thousands of miles from home, in a hostile land, facing a leader who had clearly demonstrated he was willing to sacrifice his own best men just to hold a line. The fear of a counterattack at dawn began to spread. The Mongols realised that if Alauddin unleashed his fresh elephants in the morning, the Chagatai army wouldn't just be defeated, they would be trapped and exterminated. So under the cover of darkness, the impossible happened. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon the next morning, the soldiers of Delhi gripped their weapons, expecting the thunder of hooves. They expected the final wave of the apocalypse. Instead, they heard silence. Scouts were sent forward, creeping through the tall grass, expecting an ambush. They reached the Mongol lines, empty. They reached the Mongol camp, abandoned. The horde had vanished. It was a miracle so abrupt that many refused to believe it. The Mongols had packed up their tents, their families, and their loot, and had ridden hard to the north during the night. They didn't just retreat, they fled. The greatest military force on the planet had blinked. Alauddin Khalji rode out to inspect the abandoned campsite. He didn't cheer, he didn't smile. He knew exactly what had happened. He hadn't defeated the Mongols with superior tactics or better weapons. He had defeated them with sheer, unadulterated resolve. He had outstared the devil. But while the soldiers celebrated the divine victory, Alauddin knew the truth. This wasn't a victory, it was a reprieve. The Mongols hadn't been destroyed, they had simply decided that the price of Delhi was too high today. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't make the same mistakes. The Battle of Kili was over. The immediate threat of extinction had passed, but for Alauddin the real war was just beginning. He realised that the old way of doing things, the feudal levies, the reliance on individual heroes like Zafar Khan, was obsolete. If India was to survive the 14th century, it needed to change. It needed to become a fortress. Alauddin turned his horse back toward Delhi. He was no longer just a usurper holding onto a stolen throne. He was now the shield of India, and he was about to initiate the most brutal, radical set of economic and military reforms the subcontinent had ever seen. He was going to turn his entire empire into a machine designed for one purpose: killing Mongols. The Mongols were gone, but the ghost of their invasion lingered in every shadow of Delhi. Alauddin Khalji returned to his palace not as a victor, but as a man obsessed. He had seen the abyss at Kili. He knew that the only reason Delhi was still standing was a mixture of luck, Zafar Khan's suicidal bravery, and Qutlugh Khwaja's untimely illness. Alauddin was not a man who liked to rely on luck. He realised that the existing military system of India was fundamentally broken. Up until this point, sultans relied on a feudal system, essentially renting soldiers from local nobles when war broke out. It was slow, disorganised, and loyalties were always questionable. Alauddin decided to scrap it. He wanted a standing army, a professional fighting force that answered only to him, ready to mobilise in an hour, not a month. He calculated that to permanently deter the Mongols, he needed a cavalry force of exactly 475,000 fully equipped horsemen. This is a staggering number. For context, that is larger than the active personnel of many modern European armies today. But this ambition hit a mathematical wall. To pay 475,000 men a living wage would bankrupt the royal treasury in less than 5 years. It was an impossible equation. Pay them well, and the state collapses. Pay them poorly, and the army starves or revolts. Most rulers would have reduced the size of the army. Alauddin Khalji decided to rewrite the laws of economics instead. If he couldn't pay his soldiers more money, he would simply make the money they had worth more. He introduced the market reforms, one of the most totalitarian economic experiments in human history. Alauddin issued a decree that fixed the price of every single commodity in the empire, and I mean everything: wheat, barley, rice, sugar, butter, oil, cloth, horses, cattle, and even slaves. The prices were set artificially low to match the soldiers' salary, and they were carved in stone. To ensure these prices were respected, he turned Delhi into a surveillance state. Remember the money-ants, his spies? He unleashed them on the marketplaces. They would pose as buyers. If a shopkeeper tried to sell a bag of rice for 1 copper coin above the fixed price, or if they used false weights to shortchange a customer, the punishment was swift and gruesome. The records state that officials would cut an amount of flesh from the shopkeeper's body equal to the weight he had cheated the customer. It was barbaric. It was tyrannical, but it worked. Inflation dropped to zero. For the rest of Alauddin's reign, not a single price rose in the markets of Delhi, despite droughts or wars. The army was fed, clothed, and armed for pennies. With the economic engine running, Alauddin turned to infrastructure. He didn't trust the old walls of Delhi anymore. They were too porous, too crowded. He decided to build a new capital, a city designed purely for war. He called it Siri. Siri Fort wasn't built for luxury. It was built as a command bunker. Its walls were massive, devoid of the decorative art that adorned previous capitals. It was the headquarters of the Camp of Islam, the garrison where his new professional army lived, trained, and waited. Inside this military machine, Alauddin introduced 2 more innovations that changed Indian warfare forever: Chehra and Dag. Corruption was the rot of medieval armies. Noble might claim he had 10 horses and 10 knights to get paid for them, but actually show up with 5 horses and 5 peasants. To stop this, Alauddin implemented Chehra or face, a detailed descriptive role of every single soldier: complexion, height, scars, features, essentially the first biometric ID cards of the medieval world. Then came Dag or brand. Every horse in the imperial cavalry was branded with the royal insignia. This prevented soldiers from swapping high-quality war horses for cheap ponies after the inspection, or presenting the same horse twice to draw double salary. Through fear, economics and bureaucracy, Alauddin Khalji transformed the Delhi Sultanate from a loose collection of feudal lands into a centralized, militarized superstate. He had forged a weapon capable of breaking the Mongols, and he wouldn't have to wait long to use it. The Chagatai Khanate was not done with India. They were regrouping, and the next time they came, they wouldn't be looking for a fight in the open plains. They would be coming for the throat. Alauddin Khalji was right. The silence on the plains of Kili was not peace. It was merely an intermission. In 1303, the storm returned, and this time, it was led by a general named Targi. If the Battle of Kili 1299 was a clash of strength, the invasion of 1303 was a test of timing. The Mongols had learned. They didn't come when Alauddin was strong. They waited until he had marched his shiny new army south to lay siege to the fortress of Chittor. Delhi was exposed. Its defences were stripped. When Targi's Tumans appeared on the horizon, they moved with such terrifying speed that they cut off all roads to the city before the local governors could even send reinforcements. Alauddin rushed back to Delhi just in time. But he had no army left to fight an open battle. His horses were exhausted, his men were depleted from the campaign in the south, and his equipment was broken. He couldn't repeat the aggressive charge of Kili. So he retreated into his newly built command bunker, Siri Fort. For 2 months, the Mongols besieged Siri. They looted the surrounding suburbs, burning the granaries and choking the supply lines. Inside the walls, the tension was suffocating. Alauddin dug trenches, erected wooden palisades, and waited. He watched the Mongols prowl outside his gates like wolves waiting for a wounded animal to succumb to infection. But then, history repeated its strange rhythm. Just when the city was on the brink of starvation, Taghi ordered a retreat. Perhaps it was the blistering Indian summer that the Central Asians couldn't stomach. Perhaps it was the lack of fodder for their horses. Or perhaps, looking at the grim, silent walls of Siri, Taghi realised that cracking this nut would cost him his entire army. The Mongols vanished again. This second close call snapped something inside Alauddin Khalji. He realised that repelling the Mongols wasn't enough. Surviving wasn't enough. To stop the apocalypse, he had to become the apocalypse. He had to speak the only language the Mongols understood: absolute performative cruelty. The next time the Mongols crossed the Indus River in 1305, led by generals Ali Beg and Tartak, they didn't find a sultan hiding in a fort. They found a wolf waiting for them. Alauddin's new generals, raised in the brutal meritocracy of his reforms, intercepted the Mongols at the Battle of Amroha. This time, there was no stalemate. The Indian army, fueled by the cheap grain and iron discipline of the market reforms, crushed the Mongol force. They captured the Mongol generals. They captured thousands of soldiers, and this is where the story turns into a horror movie. Alauddin Khalji ordered the prisoners to be brought to Delhi. He didn't ransom them. He didn't enslave them. He ordered them to be trampled to death by elephants in a public spectacle. But the true horror was reserved for what came next. To permanently scar the Mongol psyche, Alauddin ordered the construction of a monument. It wasn't a statue of victory or a grand arch. It was a tower built of masonry and mortar, but instead of bricks, he used the severed heads of 8,000 Mongol soldiers. It was called the Chor Minar, or the Tower of Thieves. It still stands in Delhi today, a crumbling stump of stone with dozens of circular holes. In the 14th century, each of those holes held a rotting head, staring out with dead eyes toward the north, toward the lands of the Chagatai Khanate. The message was clear, visceral, and horrifying. Alauddin was telling the Khans, "You bring me armies, I will use them as building materials." This was the psychological victory. The Mongols were used to being the ones who built pyramids of skulls. They were the ones who spread terror. When they looked at Delhi and saw a ruler who was willing to out-monstrous them, the dynamic shifted. The predator became the prey. By 1306, when the Mongols tried one last desperate invasion under a general named Kabk, the result was a foregone conclusion. They were intercepted on the banks of the Ravi River. The Indian army didn't just defeat them, they hunted them. It is said that the river turned red for miles. The prisoners were again dragged to Delhi, and their skulls were added to the growing foundations of Alauddin's towers. The secret weapon was no longer just the elephants or the spies, it was the reputation of Alauddin Khalji itself. He had constructed an aura of such intense violence that the Mongols, for the first time in their history, simply stopped coming. The road to India, once a highway for invaders, became a graveyard that even the bravest Khan dared not tread. There is a cruel irony in the life of a tyrant. The walls you build to keep the enemy out eventually become the walls that keep you in. By 1310, Alauddin Khalji had achieved the impossible. He had stopped the Mongol juggernaut. He had expanded the Delhi Sultanate deep into the Deccan, creating an empire that spanned the subcontinent. His treasury was overflowing with gold looted from the south, and his granaries were bursting with wheat confiscated from the north. He was, by every metric, the most successful ruler in the history of Delhi. But if you look closely at the Sultan in his final years, you wouldn't see a conqueror. You would see a wreck. The sheer mental load of running a totalitarian state began to crush him. Remember, Alauddin's system wasn't self-sustaining. It relied on his personal, obsessive micromanagement. Every price fixed in the market, every spy report from the Munhians, every promotion in the army, it all went through him. He was the brain of the state, and that brain was beginning to rot. His health collapsed. He developed dropsy or edema, a painful swelling of the body. As his physical strength faded, his paranoia, the very trait that had saved India from the Mongols, metastasized into madness. He stopped trusting his old generals. He stopped trusting his wife. He stopped trusting his sons. In this vacuum of trust, one figure rose to fill the void. Enter Malik Kafur. Malik Kafur was a slave general captured during the conquest of Gujarat. He was a eunuch, a man with no family ties and no claim to the throne, which made him, in Alauddin's eyes, the perfect servant. He was brilliant, beautiful, and utterly ruthless. Over time, the relationship between the dying sultan and his favourite general became the subject of intense historical speculation. Whether it was deep friendship or something more intimate, one thing was clear. Toward the end, Malik Kafur was the only person Alauddin allowed near him. As Alauddin lay dying in the Siri fort, the very bunker he built to defy the Mongols, Malik Kafur began to dismantle the dynasty from the inside. He whispered poison into the sultan's ear, convincing him that his own sons were plotting against him. In a haze of pain and suspicion, Alauddin ordered his loyal advisors imprisoned and his sons disinherited. The secret weapon of intelligence had turned inward. The spy network that once tracked Mongol movements was now being used to fabricate conspiracies within the royal family. The terror state was eating its own tail. When Alauddin Khalji finally died in January 1316, the silence that fell over Delhi wasn't one of mourning, it was one of exhaustion. And then, everything snapped. The fragility of Alauddin's system was exposed the moment his heart stopped beating. The market reforms, that incredible economic machine that had fed the army and defeated the Mongols, evaporated overnight. Why? Because they weren't based on economic laws, they were based on fear. Without the fear of the Sultan's knife, the shopkeepers immediately raised prices. The black market exploded, the intricate bureaucracy crumbled, the army, once the disciplined shield of India, descended into factional infighting. Malik Kafur attempted to rule as a puppet master, blinding Alauddin's sons and ruling through a child king, but his reign lasted only 35 days before he was assassinated by the royal bodyguards. The Khalji dynasty, which had reached such dizzying heights of power, imploded in a bath of blood within 4 years of Alauddin's death. It is a stark lesson in statecraft. Alauddin Khalji had built a machine designed for war, not for peace. He had saved Indian civilization from the Mongols, but he had hollowed out the soul of his own kingdom to do it. The people of Delhi had been safe from foreign invasion, but they had lived as prisoners in their own city. As we move to the conclusion, we have to ask the difficult question, was it worth it? When we look at the pyramids of skulls and the totalitarian markets, it's easy to judge Alauddin as a monster. But when we look at the alternative, the smoking ruins of Baghdad or Kiev, cities that didn't have an Alauddin to protect them, the judgment becomes much harder. He was the cure that was almost as bad as the disease, but in the 13th century, almost was the difference between survival and extinction. History is often a catalogue of what changed. We study the empires that fell, the borders that moved, and the cultures that were erased, but we rarely study the things that didn't happen. We rarely look at the negative space of history. The Battle of Kili, 1299, and the subsequent defence of Delhi is one of the most significant non-events in human history. Because Alauddin Khalji stood his ground, India did not become a Mongol Khanate. Unlike China, which was subsumed by the Yuan dynasty, unlike Persia, which was devastated by the Ilkhanate, and unlike Russia, which lived under the Tatar yoke for centuries, India remained India. Its distinct cultural, religious and social fabric remained intact, shielded by a wall of elephants, spies and severed heads. If Zafar Khan had not charged that day, or if Alauddin had fled to the south like his advisors begged him to, the genetic and cultural map of the modern world would look very different today. The synthesis of Indo-Islamic culture that gave us the Taj Mahal, Hindustani classical music, and the very cuisine we enjoy today might never have existed. But this survival came at a terrifying price. The story of Alauddin Khalji forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about leadership. We like our heroes to be pure. We want them to be like King Arthur, noble, just and kind. But history rarely offers such clarity. Often, the only thing strong enough to stop a monster is a bigger, darker monster. Alauddin was a murderer, a usurper, and a tyrant who turned his kingdom into a prison camp. Yet, he was also the saviour of his civilization. He was the secret weapon that broke the unstoppable force of the Mongols. He teaches us that, in the desperate math of survival, morality is often the first casualty. So as you look at the ruins of Siri Fort today, crumbling quietly in the bustle of modern New Delhi, don't just see a pile of stones, see the desperation, see the fear, and see the ruthless iron will that once stood between a trembling population and the end of the world. The Mongols are gone, the Khaljis are gone, but the choice Alauddin made to trade freedom for security is a dilemma that has never left us. It echoes in every surveillance camera, every emergency decree, and every decision made in the name of national security. Now, I want to turn this over to you. I've called Alauddin a necessary monster, but do you agree? Was the saving of Delhi worth the tyranny he inflicted on its people? Or are some prices too high to pay, even for survival? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious to see where you draw the line. If you found value in this deep dive into the forgotten wars of India, please earn your rank in our digital army by hitting that subscribe button and ringing the bell. It helps us keep these stories alive. Until next time, keep questioning the past. Because the history you know is only half the story.